Hello, everybody. This is Lane Mears coming to you. Um, it's in April 2020. Not sure when you're going to be watching this, but we are here to talk about the fifth and final session of Place, intended to help you all find your divine design and through that your place to serve in the body of Christ and in the community. Um, Thank you for watching. Thank you for investing yourself in your own spiritual development. I really hope that this has been a positive process, and that there is fruit at the end of the road, for a place for you to serve that is not only fulfilling, but in which you can have success and impact. So, today with session 5, we are going to look at the experiences in life that each one of us has had, that you have had, and how that has shaped you and shaped the places where you could serve that you might be most drawn to and might fit the best. So we're going to talk about experiences of life. This is the last session. At the end of this session, I'll have some tips on next steps, what you can do to not only continue your learning, but also to move into the application phase where you can put what you've learned about yourself and where you fit into practice and then begin to use how God made you to benefit the body and the community. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. We are on page 49. Well, that's where the session starts in your workbook. And you'll notice that there's a little story by someone talking about how their experiences in life shaped them. But I'm going to tell a little bit about my story and how that has shaped the areas where I have served and shaped who I am. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, graduated high school in Dallas, and then went off to the University of Texas as a young 17-year-old student. Really wasn't ready for college. The was a bit immature, and that showed itself pretty quickly in my college experience. I did well in high school, but it was not much effort. I got to college and it actually required effort, and I was not willing to put into the effort that was required. I was much more drawn to the parties and the freedom and playing basketball and doing other things than going to class and studying. And the result was I had a really difficult first year of university, grade wise, and that affected my emotional state and my outlook. In response, I didn't buckle down and commit myself to school. I just looked for shortcuts to make myself feel better, and that was alcohol and other things. And I found that the more I did those things, I might have felt good for a little bit, but the next day I felt worse. It affected my schoolwork as well. And at the end of my second year, I was still a terrible student and almost asked to leave the University of Texas. Fortunately, over my last 2.5 years of college, I kind of got my head on straight a bit more, and I did graduate from UT. Did not have a great GPA, but once I became a Christian at 26, well after my college days, I found that the things that I had struggled with in college, with maturity, with a lack of direction, a lack of focus, and then the resultant alcohol, drugs, other things, the way that I'd struggled really gave me a compassion for youth and for college students that may be struggling with the same things or maybe on the cusp of struggling with the same things. And so I started to get involved with college ministries at our church in Austin, Texas. That carried through just having a heart for youth wherever we went, in Africa and then here in El Salvador. I've been involved with the youth group now for about 2.5 years, and it's all, I trace it back to the experience that I had, the unsuccessful experience I had in college. But it's just an illustration of how the experiences that we go through in our life shape us clearly. That's, no one would deny that, but also may be a window into what we're drawn to in ministry, in serving the body. And that is what we're going to talk about today. So turn the page. We're going to be on page 50 of your workbook. And we're going to talk a little bit about experiences and the types of experiences that we have in life, positive, negative, successful, unsuccessful, and then begin to see how they shape us. So on page 50, you will see a quote from Romans 8:28, one of the most famous passages in the Bible, that says, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose." He does not say God causes us to experience all good things. No, it says that he causes all things to work for good. So all things can be positive experiences, uplifting experiences, tragic experiences, unsuccessful experiences. He, for those that love him and are following after him, he can use those, take those experiences, positive and negative, and use them for your good and for his glory. And so that is a fundamental message of this section, that all of our experiences in life, the darkest, the highest, the brightest, God can use for good if we will just let him, if we will hold them up before him, learn what we can from these experiences, and move on down the road following after him, and the better for the experiences that we have had. So on page 50, it says the types of life experiences in finding my place. First blank there. Hold on, let me get to my notes here. Sorry. Is spiritual experiences. That first blank on page 50. Spiritual experiences. Bear with me. I was supposed to have my Bible ready, and I don't. So give me 1 minute to pull up that verse from 1 Samuel 3. First Samuel 3. We're going to read verses 1 to 21, or I'm going to read it. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went back and lay down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide anything from me that he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So, just some background on this passage. Samuel's parents, I think, had made a vow to God that if with their firstborn they would dedicate to the Lord. When he was born, they followed through on that vow. Let Samuel be raised by Eli, who was the high prophet. Eli had some issues with his sons who were rebellious. Eli knew about it, didn't do anything about it. But anyway, we take up here, and Samuel, laying down one night to sleep, hears God speaking to him, calling him, thinks it's Eli calling him, goes to Eli several times. Eli finally realizes, you know what, that is God calling you. When you hear it again, say, here I am, Lord, speak, and do what he says. And Samuel did so. And God had a harsh word for Eli, the judgment and the consequences for his inaction previously with his sons. But the point of this passage is that as a young boy, Samuel heard God for the first time, clearly, responded in obedience, and throughout his life, this must have been a point where Samuel looked back on it and said, that was a significant life-altering experience of hearing God. That was his foundation, his anchor. When times were hard, when times were challenging, he could look back and remember, God called me to this. That spiritual experience shaped who he was and how he lived and how he viewed God for the rest of his life. And many of you may have had similar experiences, had some kind of encounter with God, a spiritual experience that really did shape you, and that may have led you into different aspects of ministry or different roles in the church. I know my wife had a pretty powerful experience one time where she and I were still dating. We were not yet engaged, but she was considering some big life questions, 3 big life questions, and prayed and just felt she needed to get in a posture of submission in her prayer. And in that position, in the midst of praying, God gave her what she felt like were 3 clear answers. Thankfully, one of them was to marry me. But the other 2 were related to some of the work and professional things that she had going on. And she has looked back at that as an anchor for her faith, and that it has shaped her, not only with me and our family, but how she views God, and given her a little passion for prayer. And so that's a great illustration as well, that spiritual experiences really can help be an insight into our place, our divine design, and where we can fit. Next blank is religious education experiences. I'm going to read a passage here that's listed as Acts 26, verses 4 and 5, about Paul. The Jews all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. So you probably know Paul's story, or Saul's story. Saul was a zealous Jew. As he said here, he was a Pharisee, the most zealous, the most knowledgeable and educated sect of Judaism, and he was passionate about his faith, and he was tutored under the prominent teacher Gamaliel as a kid, as a young man, and grew up, and he made it his passion to uphold the truth of the faith, and that entailed for him, what his perspective was at the time, stomping out the way, stomping out Christianity, and he was passionate about that. But what we're getting across here with this religious education experience is the education that Paul had, the Bible, the memorization of the Old Testament, the deep knowledge of scriptures. When he experienced his transformation on the road to Damascus, because he was so steeped in the Word, and then Jesus opened his mind, opened his eyes to who Jesus really is. Paul took that experience of meeting Jesus along with the deep knowledge of the Scriptures, and it was like a shift in his mind, and he saw how Jesus fit perfectly into the Old Testament. And Paul became, initially he was the apostle to the Jews. He had a passion for his brothers to come to faith, and he could teach and convince based on his knowledge of the Scriptures. So his religious education gave him a gift of evangelism with his brother Jews. He eventually became the apostle to the Gentiles when the Jews began to reject him. But his education shaped his future role, and that can be the same for many of you. I didn't have a religious education growing up. I didn't grow up in the church. Many of you did, and rather than think less of your testimony because you don't have a fairly dramatic conversion experience like I do in some sense, those of you who grew up in the church, reading the Bible, being taught the Bible, have a rich, deep foundation of knowledge of the Scriptures. And that education is useful. And that experience of that may be an insight into how you can and want to serve going forward in the body of Christ. So religious education experiences are significant as well. Next blank is painful experiences. Anybody have one of those? We all have. We all have had painful experiences. I'm going to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also, through Christ, our comfort overflows. We've all experienced painful experiences, whether it be loss of a parent, loss of a child, loss of a sibling, divorce, miscarriage, some kind of assault, disappointment. I mean, there's all manner of painful experiences that we could have experienced, but one of the beautiful things about faith and following Christ is that he promises, back to Romans 8:28, that he can turn all those things into good in our lives. And then when we bump up against other people and meet other people, frequently God prompts us to take the lessons that we learned in going through our painful experiences, the comfort we received from him, from Christians, from others, or just the Holy Spirit, and we can then provide that comfort and that healing for others. That's the beauty of this verse in 2 Corinthians 1, is that God wants to use us to be his hands and feet at times and to comfort people who are going through a hard time. So I'm sure we've all been through those types of experiences, and just trust that God can work good in us to go through them, but then also he can use us to provide comfort and healing to others going through hard times. All right, let's see, we are still on that same page. The top right says, what are some painful experiences common to people? There's a list there. Loss of a loved one, divorce is one of the blanks there, loss of a job, physical abuse, sexual abuse, being falsely accused, happened to me, lifestyle choices, addictions, rejection, emotional abuse, there's a blank there, persecution, and embarrassment. I'm going to ask you to pause the video here in just a second and reflect on that list and just mark in some way, a check or a dot or something, the painful experiences that you may have been through. And if there are others that aren't listed there, jot those down, just as a way to prompt your memory to be able to face some of the experiences that you have had, because they'll be useful further down in this session to have that list so we can think through some of those things. So go ahead and pause for just a minute and indicate the ones the painful experiences that you have gone through, or write down other ones if they're not listed there. And then we'll get back. Unpause when you're done. Great. So we're going to continue on page 50. Below that list you just looked at and read. The next blank is experiences of failure. Anybody experienced failure? I know I have. I told you about my college experience and how that was embarrassing. It was depressing. Later on, I graduated college, went off and worked for 2.5 years, and then decided, you know what, I want to go back to school. I want to prove to myself that the poor performance I displayed in college is not indicative of what I can do in an educational setting. And so I applied to law school, miracle of miracles, got into one place. I remember I had a terrible GPA in undergrad. But I went in thinking, I am going to work my tail off. I'm going to treat this like a job and prove to myself that I can do this. And so the experience of failure I had in college prompted me for law school to do something different. And my law school experience couldn't have been more different than my undergrad experience. I was top number 4 in my class of 210 something, had great success, and I attribute that to the experience that I had of failure in college and hard work, clearly. But let me read a passage from Matthew chapter 26. I believe it's listed, 26 verses 69 through 75. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were here with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another girl saw him, and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word that Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Can you imagine facing your failure in that moment like Peter did? Denying Jesus 3 times? Maybe not even realizing he was doing it at the time, but then once the rooster crowed, it all hit him in the face that he had denied his Savior, the Messiah, the one he'd seen preach words of life, conduct amazing miracles. And so that experience of failure had to have been powerful. We see later in the Bible where Jesus restores Peter. He asks Peter 3 questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter every time says, yes, you know I do. Yes, you know I do. Yes, you know all things. You know I do. And many scholars think that this is Jesus restoring Peter, taking away the failure, taking away the shame of his denial of 3 times and reestablishing him. But a principle of this is that failure of Peter played out in the rest of his life, and he was absolutely committed. He was not going to let that happen again. He ended up dying a martyr's death because of his faith in Jesus. So all that to say is that we all have had experiences of failure, and we can use those for good going forward. They can really shape how we live our life and then where we can plug in, kind of like with really painful experiences. Finally, the last line there is victorious experiences, the flip side of the experiences of failure. Genesis 32, verse 28. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. I'm sure each of you have had victorious experiences as well. And this one with Jacob was, again, it was a foundational thing. He was not going to let God get away without blessing him, and that blessing marked the rest of his life. And so think about that. Think about it, victorious experiences and how they have shaped your life as well. Okay, so flip to page 51 in your workbooks. And this is going to be an individual exercise. So I'm going to walk through some of the directions, then ask you to pause and to spend some time thinking about this list and what you want to check. The exercise is to check what experiences in what experiences have you had success, victory, or triumph. So think through that list. Check the ones where you've experienced victory or triumph. If there are others that are not listed there, there's a column on the right. You can put those down. And then once you've done that, spend some time thinking about it. Check the ones that are relevant to you. I want you to transfer what you've written down to your place profile sheet, the kind of the double sheet that you've been transferring your results from P, L, A, and C already. Okay? What you put on that profile sheet can be both the positive experiences identified here or negative experiences that you may have thought of on page 50, just the ones that are the biggest ones of your life, okay? So why don't you go ahead and pause, conduct that experiment, that exercise on page 51, transfer positive and negative experiences then to your place profile, then you can unpause it and we'll continue on. All right, we're back together, continuing on with some self-discovery. On page 52 is where we are right now, and we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between life experiences and abilities. Two arrows there. The first arrow says that experiences are specific events and times you can recall. So like we've talked about, whether it be my experience in college or someone's experience losing a parent or having a sibling pass away suddenly, whatever it may be, those are clearly life experiences, they're not abilities. I guess that's all I want to say there. And then we'll talk more about this category here in a second, but the second arrow is successful experiences are evaluated by your determination of success, not others' determination of success. So others may look, excuse me, at your experience and doesn't look pretty successful to them, but for you, knowing what you knew, going what you went through, you may consider it, have considered it to be a success, and that's what's most important. This may be very simple for most of you. It was to me, but I just want to emphasize that life experiences are external. They're things that we go through circumstantially in our lives, whereas abilities are just something innate, something more internal. All right, simple. Page 53. Now we're going to get some of the application part. The title is Steps in Making the Most Out of Significant Experiences. How do we reap the benefit of going through these both positive and negative experiences? First step, like in anything with educational, spiritual, physical growth, is to acknowledge it. Be honest and objective. Excuse me, I'm going to take a little water. This is a fundamental step in any kind of personal growth, whether it's addiction, with the 12 steps of alcoholism or drug addiction. The first one is to acknowledge the problem, acknowledge that you have a problem. When I was leading an NGO in Africa, I had a team member. One of my team was not performing well, and so the first thing I tried to get her to do was to acknowledge that she was not putting forth the effort, not achieving the results that she could. She refused to acknowledge that, and I had to separate her from the organization. But in order to change, the first step is always to acknowledge the issue. Be honest and objective. I faced this life experience. Not going to ignore it, not going to medicate it, going to confront it. This happened. First step. Next step. Acknowledge that you survived or thrived. If you went through this and man, it was awful and I just made it through, acknowledge that. If you made it through and like I'm a much better person, you thrived, acknowledge that too. It's okay to just survive through experiences. That's natural. We're not going to thrive in every context, every experience, but it's there are times we're just going to make it through. Third, write down any lessons that you learned. This is really valuable. As a new believer back in law school, a friend encouraged me to get a journal and to journal frequently. For years, I journaled daily. Now it's probably more 2 or 3 times a week, but it is a way to document not only prayer requests and where God answers prayers, that's significant, but significant life experiences, significant milestones in your life. Writing them down, for me, maybe it's not that way for everybody, but really helps me remember. And looking back really helps me remember what God has done too. But the third step in making the most out of significant experiences is to write it down, the lessons that you learned. Fourth, clean up any messes and turn them into victories. Make amends if you have to. Shortly after Ann and I got married in 2001, the pastor of the church where we got married asked me to come on staff as missions pastor. And I readily accepted. I was looking forward to ministry. And so it was in that role in which I started doing these place trainings for this large Baptist church in Texas. The longer I worked there, and I was a very young believer, too young to be in ministry, but I started working there and I started to see things that just didn't seem right to me with the way that the pastor conducted business, the way he interacted with people. Seeing behind the curtain, it was not attractive to me. And I began to, maybe unconsciously, maybe consciously, not really follow what the pastor was doing or wanting me to do, doing my own thing, talking bad about him in certain circles. Eventually, I quit that job, moved on. Years later, I was in this missions training course, and the guy speaking was talking about leadership and how we can only expect people to follow our spiritual leadership in their lives to the extent we follow the spiritual leaders in our own lives. Does that make sense? If I'm rebellious to the spiritual authority over me, I can't expect those under my spiritual authority to follow me. Man, and I heard this, and the first thing I thought of was my old pastor that I worked for and how I did not submit as I should have to him. I was undercutting him. And so I walked out of this training right then, called the old pastor, and I told him what I just realized and confessed, I'm sorry. And he was speechless for a bit, said, thank you for this. And it was a brief conversation. He hung up the phone. About 30 minutes later, he called me back and offered me a job. He wanted me to come back on staff with the church, which I declined, but it just was a testament to me that acknowledging the sin and trying to make amends is really powerful, not only for yourself, but it can have a ministry to others like it did with the old pastor. He was struck by that and built trust with me again, where he wanted me to come back on staff. So clean up any messes and turn them into successes. Fifth, update your story. In other words, if you're kind of stuck back in where you wrestled with some of these things, take stock of where you are and how that's going through that has changed you, what you still have to go before you, but update your story in the sense of your perspective on that story, and maybe you've not thought about it in a while, and just make sure that you can see the progress or that you've come or the progress that you want to make going forward. And then last is set a new goal. Go after it. Keep going. Don't give up. God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Believe it. Believe it. He can turn that into good. It's not good that you went through it, but God can make good of it. Believe it. Go forward in that firm belief. So, I'm going to ask here in a second that you pause the video again. Look at that list of 6 steps and think through where you are on that. If there are any steps that you have not done to overcome or to learn from some of your experiences and to get to where you can move forward in success. And then note that. Maybe write it there in your booklet. And then once you've done that, I'm going to ask you to look at page 54, which is just some illustrations of life experiences and how you can learn from those. Spiritual, religious, educational, painful, failure, victorious. There's a good chart there that I want you to look at as well. So pause here. Think through the steps on page 53, where you are, steps you want to take. Look at page 54. Think through that, study that, and then we'll unpause and we'll be back together in a minute. Okay. Hope that was significant for you. We're going to start on page 55 now, called Evaluating Experiences in Finding My Place. So this is going to be some self-reflection time. And I'm going to ask that as you go through these 5 questions, to have one significant experience in mind. And you're going to think about whether it was successful or unsuccessful, rewarding or unrewarding. And it's just kind of a self-reflection time to process some of this if you've not done this before. While going through this, I want you to think about how your personality was used to make the experience successful or not, how your spiritual gifts came into play, your abilities came into play, and or your passions, the things that we've already talked about in the first 4 sessions. Okay, make sense? So again, pause, focus on page 55, think, answer the questions, write down your responses, and then unpause. Welcome back. Getting close to the end here. We're on page 56. This is really the application, more of the application part about taking what you've learned and really where the rubber meets the road. There are 2 questions here to respond to, or 2 points where you can respond. I love that verse from James 1:22, quoted on page 56, or referred to on that. Do not only be hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. Hearing the word is significant, but doing it really causes life change, spiritual maturity. So again, 2 things to think about here. I'm going to ask you to pause, look at those 2 areas, write down your answers, and then we'll come back together after you're done. All right, party people, page 57. So what? What does all this mean? Some questions for reflection there that I'm going to ask you to do once the video is done. But I want to talk about what happens now. This is session 5. This is the last session of Place this time around. What is next? All along this process, I have talked with Gary, talked with others on the board, on the elder board as well, about what do we do to help all of you, once this is over, to really find your place. And with this coronavirus situation, it's thrown a bit of a wrench into those plans, like most plans. But one thing that I and we want to do and can do is for those that are interested to offer one-on-one times where once you've gone through all this and you have your profile documented on that worksheet page and you really want to talk to someone to say, what does all this mean? Where can I plug in? I would love to talk with you. I think Gary would love to talk with you. So I would encourage you, email me and say, Lane, I've finished with Place. It's been positive or not, but I really would love to talk with you about where I can fit in, what kind of ministry would fit with how God's made me. And that's fantastic. We can set up a video time to talk and walk through that, just a brainstorming time, and maybe I can point you in a direction or two that you might want to pursue. We do hope that once we are able to gather again, to have some kind of a ministry fair where we can have something tangible, where you can walk around, explore different opportunities, learn more about them, and then plug in that way. But in the meantime, while we're not able to gather, please contact me. We'll set up some coaching sessions and see what God can do. But God bless you. Thank you so much for your investment in your spiritual development, because as you've heard me talk about and Gary talk about, that when one part of the body succeeds, the entire body succeeds. And so it's our hope that you find that place where you can plug in and feel fulfilled, feel passionate, see God working in you and through you. And that's the whole purpose of us doing this place. So my email is Lane, Lane, .mears, MEARS, @gmail.com. Please let me know any feedback, any next steps you want to pursue, or if you'd like to pursue a coaching session. I'm happy and waiting to work with you. Blessings. Bye.